What happens when a global tour doesn't just fail, but quietly vanishes? Not postponed, not rescheduled, not delayed because of logistics or weather or politics. Just gone. No bookings, no venues, no welcome. And here's the part that made insiders freeze. It wasn't one rejection. It was every door, hotel lobbies, private dining rooms, event spaces, all closing at the same time. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. So ask yourself this right now. How does an international tour collapse without a single public protest, unless something far bigger is happening behind the scenes? Because this story isn't really about Australia, and it isn't even about a tour. It's about access, reputation, and what happens when influence stops working. Stay with me. Because the public explanation barely scratches the surface of what actually went wrong. Let's rewind. At first, everything looked normal, almost routine. Plans were floated. Conversations were opened. Calendars were tentatively marked. To the outside world, this was just another overseas appearance in the works. Another chance to reset the narrative. Another opportunity to reclaim the spotlight. But behind the scenes, something fell off. Emails went unanswered. Calls were politely delayed. Yes, slowly turned into "we'll get back to you." And then silence. Here's the contradiction that should already make you uneasy. Global figures don't usually get ignored. They get declined, negotiated with, counteroffered. Silence is rare. Silence means risk. Silence means no one wants their name attached to the decision. So why did that silence spread so fast? Insiders would later describe it as a slow-motion realization, the kind that creeps in before panic hits. At first, the assumption was simple. One hotel couldn't accommodate. One restaurant had scheduling conflicts. One venue had security concerns. Normal problems. Manageable problems. But then the list of no's kept growing. Different cities. Different brands. Same result. And here's where the story takes its first sharp turn. Because this wasn't happening in public. There were no headlines yet. No viral clips. No trending outrage. Everything was unfolding quietly, professionally, almost politely. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If no one was watching, why was everyone saying no? Think about that. Hotels make money on exposure. Restaurants love prestige guests. Venues thrive on association. Turning down high-profile bookings goes against instinct, unless the cost of saying yes suddenly outweighs the benefits. So what changed? Inside planning calls, the mood reportedly shifted from confident to confused. People started asking questions no one had asked before. Not, "When will this be confirmed?" but "Why won't anyone confirm at all?" And that's when someone said the thing that altered the room. What if it's not about logistics? What if it's about reputation? That idea landed hard. Because reputation isn't something you can fix with a better itinerary. You can't negotiate it. You can't spin it. And once enough people quietly decide they don't want to be involved, the outcome becomes inevitable. Now, let's be clear. Publicly, there were no dramatic announcements. No angry press releases. No official admissions of trouble. Everything stayed carefully worded. Carefully calm. But behind closed doors, that calm didn't exist. Frustration started leaking into conversations. Deadlines were pushed up. Calls became shorter. The tone shifted from optimistic to urgent. Because this wasn't just a trip anymore. It was a test. A test of relevance. A test of leverage. A test of whether doors would still open on name alone. And here's where the emotional core of this story begins. Because when you expect resistance, you brace yourself. But when you expect access, and instead get ignored, it feels personal. Imagine planning something under the assumption that the world still wants you, only to discover it might not. Imagine realizing that the problem isn't one person, one brand, one venue, but a collective hesitation that no one wants to publicly explain. That realization hits differently. This is the moment insiders describe as the pivot point. The moment when irritation turned into anger. When questions turned into accusations. When confidence gave way to disbelief. How could this be happening quietly? Who started it? And why now? Because timing matters here. This wasn't happening during a peak controversy. There wasn't a fresh scandal dominating headlines. Which makes the silence even louder. It suggests that the resistance didn't come from outrage, but from calculation. And calculation is cold. At some point, someone suggested pushing forward anyway. Find smaller venues. adjust expectations, scale down appearances. But that suggestion was met with resistance of its own. Why? Because scaling down would be an admission, not publicly, but internally. It would confirm what everyone was starting to suspect, that the demand simply wasn't there anymore. And that's a terrifying realization when your entire strategy depends on visibility. Now pause for a second and ask yourself this. When was the last time you heard about a high-profile tour collapsing without a single dramatic headline? Exactly. Which is why this story matters. Because public failure is loud. It gets attention. It creates sympathy or backlash. But private rejection? That's the kind of thing that reshapes strategy permanently. As the days passed, the situation became harder to ignore. More venues declined. More conversations stalled. More excuses appeared. All polite, all vague, all final. At this point, damage control began quietly. Internal messaging shifted. Language softened. Plans were reframed. The word axed wasn't used, but everyone knew what was happening. And here's the contradiction that defines this entire saga. Publicly, the image remained composed. Privately, emotions were anything but. This wasn't disappointment. It wasn't inconvenience. It was fury. Because when rejection comes without explanation, it feels humiliating. When it comes from everyone at once, it feels orchestrated, even if it isn't. And that's where suspicion creeps in. Who spoke first? Who warned whom? Did one no trigger another? No one could prove it, but no one could ignore the pattern either. Now let me ask you something directly. If you were planning a global appearance, and suddenly every potential partner went silent, what would you assume? That's the question people inside this story were asking themselves. And the answers weren't comforting. Some blamed advisors. Others blamed timing. Some blamed the media climate. And some, quietly, blamed something far more fundamental. Perception. Because perception doesn't need a press release to shift. It doesn't announce itself. It spreads quietly, through private conversations and risk assessments and brand meetings where one phrase gets repeated over and over again. Is it worth it? Once that question starts circulating, it's almost impossible to stop. And this is where the emotional stakes explode. Because the tour wasn't just about Australia. It was about proving something. Proving relevance. Proving resilience. Proving that influence hadn't faded. So when that proof failed to materialize, the reaction wasn't sadness. It was rage. Rage at the silence. Rage at the refusal. Rage at the implication that something had shifted beyond control. And yet, nothing could be said publicly. That's the cruel irony of this moment. The more intense the reaction behind closed doors, the calmer everything had to appear on the outside. No cracks. No admissions. No acknowledgement that doors had closed. Just quiet damage control. And that silence, that carefully maintained calm, is exactly why this story feels so unsettling. Because when powerful people stop being welcomed, it doesn't happen with sirens. It happens with unanswered emails, with polite declines, with "we'll circle back," messages that never get circled back to. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's already over. This is the point where insiders knew the tour wasn't coming back. Not this year. Not quietly. Not at all. But what happened next wasn't resignation. It was escalation. Because once the reality set in, the focus shifted from planning to blame. From logistics to loyalty. From outward messaging to inward conflict. And that's where this story truly begins. Because the collapse of the tour was only the first shock. What followed, the meetings, the confirmations, the reactions, would expose something far deeper than a failed itinerary. And that next moment, that's where everything stopped being manageable. Because someone finally said, out loud, what everyone else was thinking. And once those words were spoken, there was no going back. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if this trip was never just a trip? That was the question hanging in the air after the words were finally spoken out loud in that closed-door meeting. The words that changed the temperature of the room. The words no one wanted to hear, but everyone instantly understood. What if the tour wasn't about visibility, but survival? Because once that idea landed, nothing about the Australian plans looked routine anymore. Up until that moment, the tour had been framed as a reset, a chance to reconnect with audiences, a strategic return to controlled appearances, friendly crowds, carefully curated stops, soft lighting, polished messaging, smiling photos. A win. That was the promise. That was the pitch. And that's exactly why expectations were so high. Inside the planning bubble, Australia wasn't chosen randomly. It was symbolic. Commonwealth ties, familiar media terrain, a public that had once been receptive, a place where the narrative could be softened, reframed, even redeemed. At least, that was the assumption. So when early outreach began, the confidence was almost casual. This wasn't a cold call operation. It wasn't a grassroots effort. It was top-down. Names, connections, introductions that usually worked. Usually. But something strange happened right away. The enthusiasm on the other end felt muted. Not hostile. Not openly resistant. Just careful. You know that tone. The one that sounds polite but guarded. Warm words, short replies. Compliments followed by delays. Interest that never quite turns into commitment. At first, no one panicked. Why would they? High-profile tours always hit speed bumps. Calendars are tight. Security concerns come up. Brand teams need time. So the delays were rationalized. Give it a week. Follow up next Tuesday. They're probably running it past legal. But then a pattern emerged. Every conversation started sounding the same. Different cities. Different brands. Same polite hesitation. And here's the first contradiction that should have raised alarms immediately. If this tour was such a draw, why did no one want to be first? Normally, venues compete for these opportunities. Hotels want exclusivity. Restaurants want the prestige of being the place. There's usually a rush to secure dates before someone else does. But here, no rush. No urgency. No eagerness. Just pauses. Behind the scenes, the planning team doubled down. More calls. More emails. More reassurances. They adjusted proposals. Tweaked schedules. Offered flexibility. And still nothing. This is where the emotional undercurrent started shifting. Because rejection is one thing. You can argue with rejection. You can counter it. You can spin it. But uncertainty? Uncertainty eats at confidence. People started asking questions they hadn't planned to ask. Is the timing wrong? Is the market saturated? Is there something we're missing? Those questions lingered longer than they should have. Then came the first confirmed no. Not a delay. Not a maybe. A clean, professional refusal. No explanation beyond the standard language. Scheduling conflicts. Capacity issues. Internal considerations. On paper, it looked harmless. In context, it felt like a crack in the foundation. Because once one door closes clearly, everyone else feels safer closing theirs too. That's how it works. No one wants to be the outlier. No one wants to take the risk alone. And suddenly, the confidence that had carried this tour from concept to planning began to wobble. Inside one meeting, someone tried to lighten the mood. Maybe Australia just isn't feeling it right now. A nervous laugh followed. But no one really laughed. Because deep down, everyone knew this wasn't about feeling it. This wasn't about taste or trends. This was about calculation. Brands don't feel. They assess risk. And the unspoken fear started to surface. What if the risk profile had changed? Think about it from their perspective. A hotel doesn't just offer rooms. It offers association, photos, press, the possibility of headlines, good or bad. A restaurant doesn't just serve food. It hosts attention, and attention can be dangerous. So if the calculation suddenly tips from prestige to problem, the decision becomes easy. Say no quietly. Avoid headlines. Move on. That's exactly what seemed to be happening. But inside the bubble, that explanation was hard to swallow. Because for years, the strategy had relied on the assumption that attention, any attention, could be managed, controlled, redirected, monetized. So why now did attention feel like a liability? That question sparked tension. Some argued this was a temporary blip, a cooling-off period, a media hangover that would pass. Others weren't so sure. They pointed to subtle signs. The tone of emails, the cautious language, the lack of follow-up questions. No one was asking, can we make this work? They were asking, how do we avoid this? That difference matters. At this point, the tour's original purpose came back into focus. This wasn't just about showing up. It was about proving something. Proving that influence remained intact. Proving that partnerships were still viable. Proving that access hadn't diminished. And with every unanswered message, that proof felt further away. Let me ask you something. If you were building your strategy around public engagement, and suddenly the public-facing gatekeepers stepped back, wouldn't you start questioning everything? That's exactly what began happening. The planning documents changed tone. Early drafts were optimistic, filled with language about momentum and growth. Later versions were cautious, defensive, heavy on contingencies. One insider described it as watching confidence drain out of the room in real time. And then came the moment no one could ignore. A second confirmed refusal. Then a third. Different sectors. Same result. Now it was undeniable. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't bad timing. This was a shift. And yet, publicly, nothing changed. No statements. No leaks. No acknowledgement. The outside world still assumed the tour was on track. Or at least under consideration. Because that's how these things usually work. But internally, the language had already changed. People stopped saying when. They started saying if. That single word changed everything. Because once you admit if, you're no longer planning a tour. You're managing a failure. And managing failure quietly requires discipline. It requires control. It requires suppressing emotion. Which brings us to the emotional center of this chapter. Because while the strategy shifted on paper, the feelings behind it did not. Frustration turned sharp. Not explosive, not yet, but simmering. There was a sense of disbelief that bordered on insult. How dare they ignore us? How did this happen without warning? Who let this narrative form? Those questions circled endlessly. Some blamed advisors for overestimating appeal. Others blamed external forces. Media narratives, online criticism, shifting public mood. But beneath all of that was a deeper fear no one wanted to articulate. What if this isn't temporary? What if this isn't about one tour, but about a permanent recalibration of relevance? That fear changes behavior. It makes people defensive. It makes them reactive. It makes them angry. And anger, when contained, doesn't disappear. It redirects. By the end of this phase, the tour had already lost its original shape. What was once envisioned as a confident, high-profile run now looked fragile, conditional, uncertain. Still, there was one last hope. A belief that once a single major venue committed, everything else would follow. That all it took was one yes to break the silence. So attention turned to one final outreach. One conversation that felt promising. One brand that hadn't said no yet. One opportunity to reverse the momentum. The stakes were enormous. Because if this door closed too, there would be no more pretending. And when that response finally came back, it didn't just say no. It said something far worse, without using a single harsh word. And that message would force a reckoning no one was prepared for. Because in that moment, it became clear the tour wasn't just off. It was unwanted. And once that reality settled in, the question stopped being, how do we fix this? It became something much more dangerous. Who is responsible for this? And who is going to pay the price? But the confrontation that followed didn't happen immediately. First came silence. Then came anger. And then came a reaction that stunned even the people in the room. What happens when the answer isn't just no, but a signal? Because that's what this was. Not a rejection buried in polite language. Not a scheduling conflict that could be worked around. Not a delay that bought time. This was the moment the room went quiet. The response arrived without drama. No emotional language. No explanation beyond the bare minimum. Professional. Courteous. Final. And the instant it was read aloud, everyone knew. This wasn't like the others. Up until now, refusals had been vague enough to reinterpret. Soft enough to challenge. You could tell yourself a follow-up call might change things. You could pretend the door wasn't fully closed. But this door didn't just close. It locked. Here's why it mattered so much. The venue in question wasn't random. It wasn't a fringe option. It was a flagship. The kind of place that sets the tone. The kind of yes that gives everyone else cover to say yes to. And the assumption had been simple. If this one comes through, the rest will fall in line. That's how it usually works. So when the answer came back negative, it didn't just remove one option. It collapsed a strategy. You could feel it instantly. The air changed. The conversation slowed. Someone reread the message, hoping they'd missed something. A loophole. A condition. Anything. There wasn't one. And here's the detail insiders still talk about. The refusal didn't sound apologetic. It sounded cautious. That distinction matters. Apologies imply regret. Caution implies fear. Fear of backlash. Fear of headlines. Fear of being associated with something that might spiral. So ask yourself this. What would make a major venue decide that silence and refusal were safer than prestige and publicity? The answer wasn't written in the email. But everyone in the room felt it. This wasn't about space. It wasn't about scheduling. It wasn't even about security. It was about risk. Once that realization landed, the conversation shifted from logistics to something far more uncomfortable. Perception. Someone finally said it out loud. They don't want to be first. And that sentence unlocked everything. Because being. And here's the contradiction no one wanted to confront. The louder the outrage felt internally, the quieter everything had to remain externally. No venting. No pressure tactics. No public complaints. Because applying pressure would only confirm the fears these venues already had. So the anger stayed contained. But contained anger doesn't disappear. It looks for direction. By this point, the timeline had shifted dramatically. What was once mapped out confidently now felt tentative. Calls were rescheduled. Outreach slowed. Expectations lowered, unofficially. Someone asked the question no one wanted to answer. What if none of them say yes? The room froze. That question didn't get dismissed. It didn't get laughed off. It didn't get reframed. It just sat there. Because suddenly, it felt plausible. And that possibility changed the stakes completely. If this tour failed quietly, it wouldn't just be a missed opportunity. It would be a signal to everyone else watching from a distance. A signal that access had changed. That invitations were no longer guaranteed. That the brand no longer pulled the way it used to. And once that signal spreads, it's almost impossible to reverse. So a decision was made. One last push. One final attempt to secure a commitment from a partner whose response could break the pattern. Everything rode on it. If that door opened, the narrative could still be saved. The refusals reframed as anomalies. The tour revived with momentum. If it didn't, there would be no more ambiguity. The waiting that followed was agonizing. Hours passed, then days. Every notification triggered a spike of tension. Every silence deepened the dread. And when the reply finally arrived, it didn't just reject the proposal. It reframed the entire situation. Because the language used, carefully chosen, legally safe, implied something devastating without stating it outright. It suggested caution. It suggested distancing. It suggested that association itself had become a concern. That was the moment the tour stopped being at risk. It became untenable. And that realization triggered the emotional response no one had been able to contain anymore. Because once you understand that people aren't just saying no, they're protecting themselves from you, something inside snaps. That's when frustration turns into fury. That's when blame stops being abstract. And that's when the internal dynamic begins to fracture. The tour wasn't just falling apart. It was exposing fault lines that had been there all along. And the next chapter? That's where silence gave way to confrontation. Because once the first door slammed shut, the rest didn't just follow. They echoed. What does it mean when nobody explains themselves? That was the question that kept surfacing as the echoes of those closed doors kept bouncing around the room. Not shouted, not argued, just lingering. Because after the first door slammed, after the second refusal hardened into certainty, something even stranger happened. People stopped replying, not declining, not negotiating, not even pretending. They went quiet. And silence, in this world, is never neutral. At first, the team treated it like a glitch. A timing issue, a missed message, a staffer out of office. They sent polite follow-ups. They reattached proposals. They tweaked subject lines, softened language, added reassurances. Nothing. No acknowledgement. No received. No we'll review. Just absence. And here's where the tension shifted from professional to psychological. Because when a single venue says no, you can compartmentalize it. When a handful hesitate, you can strategize around it. But when entire sectors go silent at once, hotels, restaurants, event spaces, you're no longer dealing with individual decisions. You're dealing with a shared instinct. Ask yourself this. How often do competitors behave the same way without coordination? Rarely. Yet that's exactly what this felt like. Different brands, different cities, different leadership teams. Same response. None. Inside planning calls, voices grew clipped. Conversations got shorter. The mood tightened. People started speaking in half sentences, as if saying the full thought out loud might make it permanent. Someone finally asked the question everyone was circling. Are they talking to each other? No one answered right away, because whether they were or not didn't really matter. The effect was the same. A wall had formed. And walls don't need meetings to exist. They just need enough people to decide not to open their doors. This is where the contradiction at the heart of the situation became impossible to ignore. Publicly, nothing had changed. There were no breaking stories. No new controversies dominating headlines. No obvious trigger that explained this collective withdrawal, which meant the cause wasn't loud. It was quiet. Reputational shifts almost always are. They don't arrive with a bang. They arrive with a pause, a hesitation, a raised eyebrow in a boardroom, a risk assessment that lands just slightly on the wrong side of acceptable. And once that happens, the safest move is often the least visible one. Say nothing. Do nothing. Engage with nothing. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. From the inside, it feels like suffocation. Because without responses, there's nothing to argue against. No terms to negotiate. No misconceptions to correct. Silence doesn't give you leverage. It takes it away. And that's when the emotional temperature spiked. Frustration that had been contained now had nowhere to go. You can't debate a ghost. You can't persuade an inbox that won't respond. You can't pressure people who've decided invisibility is their shield. So the frustration turned inward. Meetings grew tense. Voices sharpened. The same questions kept coming up in different forms. Who let this happen? Why weren't we warned? How did we miss this shift? Those questions weren't rhetorical anymore. They were accusations in waiting. Because here's the truth no one wanted to confront yet. This silence didn't start overnight. It had been building. Slowly. Quietly. In conversations the team wasn't part of. And that realization carries an extra sting. It suggests you're no longer in the room where decisions are made. At one point, someone tried to downplay it. Silence doesn't mean rejection. Technically true. But in this context, silence meant something far worse. It meant avoidance. And avoidance is what people do when they don't want to be associated with the outcome, whatever it may be. That's when the language inside the operation shifted again. The word tour started disappearing from documents, replaced by phrases like potential appearances and exploratory outreach. Plans became hypothetical. Certainty evaporated. And yet, publicly, the posture remained unchanged. Confident, unbothered, controlled. That disconnect between what was being projected and what was being felt created pressure. Because the longer silence dragged on, the harder it became to maintain that composure internally. One insider later described it like this. It felt like shouting into a void and pretending it was an echo. You keep talking. You keep pitching. But nothing comes back. And then came the moment that crystallized the situation. A well-placed contact, someone who had always responded quickly in the past, finally replied. Not with an offer. Not with interest. With 3 words. No comment, thanks. No explanation. No follow-up. No opening. Just a wall, politely worded. That message landed harder than any outright refusal. Because no comment isn't about scheduling. It's about distance. It's what people say when they want to step away without making a statement. When they don't want their words quoted. When they don't want to be pulled into a narrative. And suddenly, the pattern made sense. This wasn't about capacity. It wasn't about logistics. It was about containment. Brands weren't just declining participation. They were avoiding association entirely. And that realization sent a chill through the room. Because once avoidance becomes the strategy, there's no way to force engagement without escalating the situation. And escalation was the last thing anyone wanted. Why? Because escalation creates headlines. And headlines would only validate the fears that caused the silence in the first place. This is the paradox that trapped the entire operation. Push harder, and you look desperate. Stay quiet, and the silence wins. So they waited. They watched. They monitored. They hoped someone would blink. No one did. Instead, the silence deepened. Emails went unanswered longer. Calls stopped being returned entirely. Even informal check-ins dried up. It was as if an invisible memo had gone out. Best to stay out of this. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced that moment when you realize people aren't arguing with you anymore? Not because you've won, but because they've decided it's not worth engaging? That's what this felt like. And emotionally, that's devastating. Because conflict still acknowledges relevance. Silence suggests irrelevance, or worse, risk. By this stage, anger wasn't just simmering. It was boiling under the surface. Not just at the refusals, but at the implication behind them. The suggestion that something fundamental had changed, and no one had bothered to say it out loud. Who decided this? When did it happen? And why were we the last to know? Those questions started morphing into something sharper. Someone must have started this. Someone must have warned them. Someone must have shifted the perception. Suspicion crept in. Not externally, internally. Advisors were scrutinized. Past decisions re-examined. Messaging choices second-guessed. Everything became fair game. Because when doors close quietly, the instinct is to look for betrayal. And betrayal doesn't have to be dramatic to be effective. Sometimes it's just a conversation you weren't invited to. At this point, the tour was effectively dead. Not officially. Not publicly. But functionally. There were no venues. No accommodations. No momentum. And yet, the hardest part wasn't accepting that reality. It was accepting what it meant. Because if silence had replaced engagement here, what about future plans? Future partnerships? Future appearances? Was this an isolated case, or the beginning of a pattern? That question hung over everything, and it demanded an answer. Which is why a decision was made that would change the tone of everything that followed. If no one would speak publicly, the focus would turn inward. No more vague optimism. No more waiting. No more pretending this was salvageable. There would be a reckoning. A closed-door confrontation where questions wouldn't be softened and emotions wouldn't be managed. Because someone needed to explain how a global tour had been reduced to unanswered emails. And that meeting, when it finally happened, didn't just surface explanations. It surfaced anger. The kind of anger that had been building quietly, just like the silence that caused it. And once that anger found a voice, the situation stopped being about venues and logistics altogether. It became personal. Because when no comment becomes the loudest answer, the next thing people want is accountability. And the demand for that accountability would trigger reactions no one was prepared for. Reactions that would spill beyond planning rooms and into decisions with long-term consequences. But the explosion didn't happen all at once. First came the meeting. Then came the words that crossed a line. And once those words were spoken, the silence was officially over. Who do you blame when everyone stops answering? That was the first question thrown onto the table when the emergency meeting finally happened. Not politely. Not diplomatically. It wasn't asked as a discussion point. It was asked like a challenge. Because by the time everyone gathered in that room, the silence outside had become unbearable. This wasn't a scheduled strategy session. This wasn't a weekly check-in. This was reactive, urgent. The kind of meeting you call when something has already gone wrong and no one wants to be the one to say it out loud. The atmosphere was tense from the start. Phones were silenced. Laptops stayed closed. No one wanted distractions, and no one wanted a digital trail. The room felt smaller than usual, heavier. Conversations that normally happened in side comments or after the fact were about to happen face-to-face. And that alone told you everything you needed to know. Because when communication gets pulled offline, it means trust is strained. The opening remarks were calm. Too calm. A summary of where things stood. A neutral rundown of outreach attempts. A list of venues contacted, responses received or not received. It was delivered in the kind of flat tone people use when they're trying to keep emotion from breaking through. But you could feel the tension under every sentence. As the update ended, no one spoke. That silence wasn't awkward. It was loaded. Finally, someone broke it. This doesn't make sense. Not shouted. Not angry. Just firm. And with that, the floodgates opened. Questions came fast, overlapping, sharp. How did we go from tentative interest to total avoidance? Who was managing these relationships? Why weren't we warned that sentiment had shifted this much? Each question carried an unspoken accusation. Because this wasn't being framed as bad luck anymore. It was being framed as failure. Someone tried to slow things down. Suggested stepping back. Looking at the bigger picture. Considering external factors. That attempt didn't land. Because everyone in the room knew external factors didn't explain this level of uniform silence. Markets fluctuate. Media cycles move on. But collective disengagement like this doesn't just happen unless something triggers it. And that something had not been identified. Yet, as the discussion deepened, the tone changed. Less analytical. More emotional. Frustration surfaced first. Why were we still chasing people who clearly didn't want to engage? Why were we pretending this was still a logistics problem? Then irritation. Why were advisors still using language like delayed and under review when nothing was moving? Why was no one willing to admit this was bigger than a scheduling issue? And finally, anger. Anger at the venues. Anger at the media climate. Anger at the perception that had formed without warning. But anger doesn't stay pointed outward for long. Eventually, it turns inward. Someone asked the question that shifted the meeting completely. When did this start? The room went quiet again. Because that question demanded honesty. Not spin. Not optimism. Not reassurance. Honesty. And the answers that followed weren't comforting. It started months earlier, someone said. Subtle shifts in tone. Slight hesitations that were easy to ignore at the time. Early signs that interest wasn't as automatic as it once was. Why weren't those signs escalated? The response was cautious. We didn't think they meant anything. That answer didn't go over well. Because in hindsight, everything means something. Especially when your strategy depends on perception. The conversation took a sharper turn. Who was monitoring sentiment? Who was tracking brand temperature? Who decided this was still safe to pursue at scale? The room began to fracture along invisible lines. Some defended the decisions. Others questioned them openly. The dynamic shifted from collaborative to confrontational. Not explosive yet, but tight, controlled, on edge. At one point, someone tried to reframe the situation. This isn't about rejection, they said. It's about timing. That sentence landed wrong. Immediately, another voice cut in. If it were timing, someone would have said that. Silence followed. Because that was the truth everyone was circling. Timing issues get explanations. Reputation issues get silence. And silence was all they'd received. That realization settled heavily over the room. The meeting moved into damage assessment. What had already been lost? What relationships were strained beyond repair? What could still be salvaged? The answers were grim. No confirmed venues. No accommodations. No clear path forward. And worse, no appetite from partners to even discuss alternatives. At this point, someone suggested pausing all outreach entirely. Stop calling. Stop emailing. Stop pushing. Wait for the temperature to cool. That suggestion triggered immediate pushback. Pausing looked like retreat. Retreat looked like weakness. And weakness, in this context, felt unacceptable. Because retreat would mean acknowledging what no one wanted to say yet. That the tour was over. That the doors had closed. That influence had limits. And admitting that, even privately, felt like surrender. This is where the emotional stakes exploded. Voices rose. Not yelling, but sharper. More pointed. Sentences cut off mid-thought. Interruptions became frequent. Someone accused someone else of misreading the landscape. Someone else accused leadership of ignoring warning signs. Another questioned whether the brand had been overexposed. The word overexposed lingered, because overexposure implies fatigue, and fatigue implies decline. No one wanted to accept that, but no one could dismiss it either. Then came the moment that changed everything. Someone, quiet until now, spoke up. What if they're not rejecting the tour? Heads turned. What if they're rejecting us? The room froze. That sentence reframed the entire situation. Because rejecting a tour is temporary. Rejecting a person, or a brand, is something else entirely. And suddenly, every unanswered email looked different. Every polite refusal felt personal. Every no comment sounded like avoidance. The implications were staggering. If this wasn't about one project, but about broader perception, then no amount of rescheduling or rebranding would fix it. It would require something far more difficult. Change, and change is threatening, especially to people who believe they've already adjusted enough. The tension in the room became palpable. Someone tried to shut the line of thinking down, said it was too speculative, too emotional, but the damage was done. Once the idea was spoken, it couldn't be unheard. The meeting shifted into crisis mode. What do we say publicly if asked? How do we frame this internally? Who is authorized to confirm anything? That last question mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because confirmation, especially from the wrong person, could lock this narrative into place. And that's when the conversation turned to control. Who had it? Who didn't? And who might break ranks? The fear wasn't just external anymore. It was internal. People began watching each other carefully, listening for tone, reading between lines. Because when pressure builds, loyalty gets tested. Someone asked if a statement should be prepared. A holding line. Something neutral. Something that could buy time. The suggestion was met with hesitation. Any statement would invite questions. Questions would invite scrutiny. Scrutiny would expose what they didn't yet understand themselves. So the decision was made to stay silent. For now. But silence inside the room felt different than silence outside. Inside, it felt like pressure. Like something pushing against the walls, looking for a release. The meeting stretched on, but no solutions emerged. Only realizations. That this wasn't going away quietly. That something fundamental had shifted. That the plan everyone believed in no longer fit the reality. Advisors, strategists, gatekeepers, people whose job it was to read the room. Why didn't they see this coming? Why didn't they warn us? Why did they let optimism override reality? Those questions were asked repeatedly, sometimes politely, sometimes not. And here's where the contradiction deepened. The same people now being blamed were the ones who had once been praised for navigating storms, reframing narratives, pushing through resistance. So which was it? Were they suddenly incompetent? Or was something else at play? That contradiction fueled resentment. Because admitting the latter would mean admitting a loss of control, a loss of leverage, a loss of influence. And that's not an easy thing to swallow when your entire identity has been built around commanding attention. Behind closed doors, voices rose. Not screaming. Not yet. But sharp enough to cut. Accusations surfaced in fragments. You said this was still viable. You assured us interest was there. You told us Australia would be receptive. Each statement carried the same undertone. You were wrong. And being wrong at this level doesn't just damage strategy. It damages trust. The mood became volatile. One moment calm, the next charged. People found themselves walking on eggshells, measuring every word. Because no one wanted to be the next target. At the center of it all was disbelief. How could this happen so quietly? No warning shots. No public backlash. No clear turning point. Just withdrawal. That lack of a visible trigger made the anger feel unjust. As if something had been taken without explanation. And unjust anger seeks release. At one point, someone suggested reframing the narrative internally. This isn't a snub, they said. It's a pause. The response was immediate. A pause implies it's coming back. Silence followed. Because everyone knew the truth. Nothing about this felt temporary. Another voice chimed in, more cautiously. Maybe we're overreacting. That didn't land well either. Because overreaction would imply fear. And fear, in this context, felt humiliating. The anger sharpened again. If this was about fear, whose fear was it? The venue's? Or ours? That question lingered uncomfortably. Then came the moment insiders would later describe as the breaking point. Someone asked, quietly but firmly, why are we pretending this isn't personal? That sentence hit hard. Because up until then, everyone had been dancing around it. Treating the situation like a technical failure. A planning issue. A branding hiccup. But if the rejection was personal, if the avoidance was about association, then this wasn't a problem you could solve with better logistics or softer messaging. It was a judgment. And judgments sting. That realization triggered a different kind of anger. Not loud. Not chaotic. Cold. The kind of anger that focuses. That narrows its scope. That looks for accountability. People started revisiting old decisions. Past interviews. Public statements. Strategic moves that once seemed bold but now looked risky. Everything was re-examined through a harsher lens. Was this the moment things tipped? Did this alienate partners? Did that statement push us into too much trouble territory? Those questions weren't academic. They were loaded. Because answering them meant assigning responsibility. And responsibility implies consequences. This is where internal dynamics began to fracture. Allies grew cautious. Conversations became guarded. People stopped speaking freely, worried their words might be used later. Trust eroded quickly. And when trust erodes under pressure, power dynamics shift. Who has influence now? Who gets listened to? Who is seen as a liability? Those calculations started happening silently, behind polite smiles and controlled tones. But make no mistake, they were happening. The anger wasn't just emotional anymore. It was strategic. At some point, someone made a suggestion that revealed just how far things had shifted. We need to know who confirmed this. Not if it's true. Who confirmed it? That suggestion wasn't about curiosity. It was about control. Because confirmation is dangerous. Once something is confirmed, internally or externally, it stops being deniable. It becomes real. And reality demands response. The fear wasn't that the truth would get out. The fear was who would be seen as responsible for letting it out. Because if someone acknowledged the tour was axed, especially someone high profile, it would crystallize the narrative. And once crystallized, it couldn't be softened. That's when the anger turned into vigilance. People started monitoring conversations more closely, watching who spoke to who said what and when. Every call felt risky. Every message felt consequential. The pressure was immense. And under that pressure, emotions don't just simmer. They spill. Someone snapped during a call. Not screaming, but sharp enough to shock. A line was crossed. A tone used that couldn't be taken back. Witnesses described it as rage barely contained. Not at the situation. At the implication behind it. Because being ignored is one thing. Being deemed untouchable is another. And that's what this felt like. The anger wasn't just about losing a tour. It was about losing access. Losing relevance. Losing the assumption that doors would open simply because they always had before. That loss hits at identity. And when identity feels threatened, reactions escalate. By the end of this phase, it was clear something had to give. Either the narrative would be controlled decisively, or it would control them. And controlling it meant making a choice no one wanted to make. A confirmation. Not public. Not yet. But clear enough that everyone inside the circle understood the truth. The person who would deliver that confirmation wasn't expected to do so. Which is why, when it happened, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Because once that confirmation landed, the anger that had been simmering finally had a target. And the next chapter? That's where restraint broke. What if the snub wasn't emotional at all? What if it was calculated? That was the uncomfortable realization that settled in after the confirmation finally made its way through the inner circle. Not shouted, not announced, just acknowledged in a way that left no room for denial. The tour wasn't paused. It wasn't postponed. It wasn't being reworked. It was done. And once that truth was absorbed, the anger that had been flaring in every direction suddenly narrowed its focus. Because now the question wasn't whether this had happened. It was why it had happened so cleanly, so quietly, so uniformly. That's when someone finally said the thing no one had wanted to admit earlier. This isn't personal. It's procedural. At first, the idea sounded absurd. How could something that felt this humiliating not be personal? But the more it was examined, the more disturbing it became. Because if this wasn't driven by outrage or vendettas or secret grudges, if it wasn't fueled by emotion at all, then it meant something far more dangerous had occurred. It meant a system had decided to opt out. Think about how hospitality actually works at the top level. Hotels don't just sell rooms. Restaurants don't just serve food. Venues don't just host events. They sell safety, brand safety, reputational safety, operational safety. Every major booking is evaluated not just on revenue, but on risk. Who might complain? Who might protest? Who might drag them into a narrative they can't control? And here's the key detail insiders began to understand too late. Risk doesn't need proof. It only needs probability. No scandal has to explode for risk to be deemed unacceptable. All it takes is the sense that something might spiral, that association might invite scrutiny, debate, or backlash that isn't worth the upside. Once that calculation tips, the decision is simple. You disengage. Quietly. And that's exactly what appeared to have happened here. No boycott. No public stance. No dramatic rejection. Just a series of internal assessments that all landed on the same conclusion. Better to stay out of it. That's what made this so chilling. Because it suggested the hospitality industry hadn't rebelled loudly. It had rebelled silently. And silent rebellions are almost impossible to fight. Inside the circle, this realization triggered a second wave of emotion. Different from anger, but just as intense. Shock. Because if this was a procedural decision repeated across brands, it meant there was no single villain to confront. No one to pressure. No conversation that could reverse it. You can't argue with a risk model. You can't negotiate with caution. You can't shame people who never took a public position. The door doesn't slam in your face. It simply never opens. And here's where the contradiction became painfully clear. Publicly, the narrative still suggested influence. Global reach. Ongoing relevance. Privately, systems that once welcomed association were quietly opting out. Those two realities could not coexist for long. At one point, someone tried to reassure the room. This is just Australia. That argument didn't survive scrutiny, because patterns had already begun to emerge elsewhere. Nothing dramatic. Nothing headline-worthy. Just subtle shifts. Delayed replies. Less enthusiasm. More layers of approval required. The same silence. The same caution. That's when the phrase started circulating internally. We're no longer low risk. That phrase landed like a verdict. Low risk is the gold standard for partnerships. It means predictability, manageability, comfort. High risk doesn't necessarily mean dangerous. It just means complicated. And complicated is something brands avoid whenever possible. So the rebellion wasn't emotional. It wasn't ideological. It wasn't coordinated in secret meetings. It was practical. A series of independent decisions that all arrived at the same place. Opt out. That realization drained the last bit of optimism from the room. Because if this wasn't about fixing messaging or waiting out a news cycle, then the solution wasn't simple. It would require a fundamental shift. And fundamental shifts threaten power structures. That's why the tension spiked again. Some argued this interpretation was too pessimistic. That brands were overreacting. That perception could be recalibrated with time. Others weren't convinced. They pointed to the speed of disengagement, the uniformity, the way no one even wanted to talk. Recalibration requires engagement, and engagement was gone. That's when the emotional beat turned inward again. If the world had quietly decided to disengage, then who was responsible for managing that risk before it reached this point? Why weren't these warning signs addressed earlier? Why was confidence allowed to override caution? Why was exposure treated like leverage instead of liability? Those questions didn't have clean answers. And unanswered questions under pressure create fractures. Voices grew sharper again. The earlier calm analysis gave way to frustration. Not explosive, but heavy. Because this wasn't something you could fix quickly. It wasn't even something you could publicly acknowledge without making it worse. Admitting that partners had opted out due to risk would only confirm their decision. So silence remained the strategy. But silence comes at a cost. Inside the operation, the realization set in that future plans would now face the same scrutiny, the same hesitation, the same quiet opt-outs. This wasn't a one-off failure. It was a new baseline. And baselines are hard to shift once they settle. Someone asked a question that stopped the conversation cold. If this is how they see us now, what happens next time we ask? No one answered immediately, because the honest answer was terrifying. Next time might look exactly the same, or worse. The anger that followed wasn't loud. It was resigned. And resignation is far more dangerous than rage. Because rage still believes something can be changed. Resignation accepts that it already has. By the end of this chapter, the mood had shifted decisively. The focus moved away from salvaging the tour, toward controlling fallout, toward managing perception internally, toward deciding who would speak, who wouldn't, and how tightly information would be held. Because if this quiet rebellion had taught them anything, it was this. The loudest damage happens when no one says anything at all, and that understanding led directly to the next crisis. Because once you accept that the system has opted out, the next fear isn't rejection. It's exposure. Who might talk? Who might confirm? Who might break the silence? And the moment someone finally did, that's when everything escalated beyond repair. What do you say when the truth is already decided, but not yet spoken? That was the dilemma that surfaced the moment the quiet rebellion was fully understood. The tour was finished. The doors were closed. The risk calculation had been made. But the public didn't know. And as long as the public didn't know, there was still a chance to shape how this moment would be remembered. Not as rejection, not as a snub, but as a choice. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Because in the world of image and influence, control isn't about changing reality. It's about framing it before someone else does. So attention turned to the only tool still available: language. Inside the inner circle, drafts began circulating. Not full announcements, not official confirmations, just holding language. Neutral phrasing. Carefully constructed sentences designed to sound confident while revealing nothing. Words like reassessing, exploring alternatives, adjusting timelines. Each phrase was debated intensely. Too vague, and it sounded evasive. Too specific, and it sounded like admission. The goal wasn't clarity. It was containment. Someone suggested a proactive statement. Get ahead of rumors. Frame the decision as intentional, strategic, mutually agreed upon. That idea split the room. On one side were those who believed silence was no longer safe, that whispers would turn into speculation, and speculation would turn into headlines. Better to say something now, while there was still room to maneuver. On the other side were those who feared that any statement at all would invite questions they couldn't answer. Why now? What changed? Who decided? And those questions were dangerous, because the real answers didn't sound good. The debate dragged on. Voices rose, then lowered again. The same phrases were repeated, adjusted, softened, sharpened. It wasn't about wording. It was about control. Who controls the narrative when access disappears? At one point, someone read aloud a draft that described the situation as a scheduling shift due to evolving priorities. The room went quiet. Not impressed, not reassured, unconvinced, because evolving priorities implies choice, and choice implies agency. But internally, everyone knew this wasn't a choice. It was a response, and responses are harder to sell as strategy. Another draft tried a different angle. Focus on values. Focus on mission. Focus on listening to communities. That language had worked before. It softened edges. It redirected criticism. This time, it felt hollow. Why? Because values don't explain silence. And silence was the story here. Someone finally said what everyone was thinking. No one is buying this. That sentence landed hard. Because if the people inside the room didn't believe the language, how could anyone outside? And yet, doing nothing felt equally risky. The longer the silence dragged on, the more space it created for others to fill. Media speculation, online theories, whisper networks that didn't need confirmation to spread. So the compromise was reached. No announcement, but a readiness to respond. If asked directly, there would be an answer. Not detailed, not emotional, just enough to redirect. And that answer would be consistent. This was important, because consistency is the backbone of plausible narratives. Everyone would say the same thing, use the same phrases, avoid the same details. That's how you keep stories from fracturing. But here's the contradiction that made this strategy fragile from the start. Consistency requires discipline, and discipline is hard to maintain when emotions are running high, especially when people feel wronged. As the language was finalized, reactions varied. Some felt relieved. Finally, there was a plan, a script, something to lean on. Others felt uneasy, because the language didn't just avoid the truth. It rewrote it, and rewriting reality, even temporarily, creates pressure. Pressure on those expected to stick to the story. Pressure on those who know more than they're supposed to say. Pressure on those who feel blamed without being named. That pressure builds quietly, and pressure always looks for a release. The first test of the strategy came sooner than expected. A routine inquiry. A casual question. Nothing aggressive. Just someone asking about the status of upcoming plans. The response was delivered exactly as rehearsed. Measured, neutral, confident. On the surface, it worked. The question moved on. The conversation shifted. No immediate follow-ups. But inside, the reaction was different. Because delivering the line made the reality feel heavier. Saying it out loud, even in softened form, made it real. And for some, that was unbearable. Behind closed doors, the frustration reignited. Why are we pretending this is mutual? Why are we acting like we chose this? Why are we protecting people who wouldn't even return our calls? Those questions weren't just rhetorical. They carried resentment. And resentment doesn't stay contained forever. As days passed, the holding language was used more frequently. Each time, it worked just enough to deflect, just enough to avoid escalation. But something else was happening at the same time. Cracks. Small ones at first. A phrase slightly altered. A tone slightly sharper. A pause that lasted too long before an answer. To an outsider, these differences were invisible. To insiders, they were alarming. Because inconsistency is how narratives unravel. And once a narrative unravels, it doesn't matter how carefully it was constructed. It collapses. The biggest risk wasn't the media. It was someone inside deciding they were done playing along. Because when people feel silenced, when they feel their anger is being managed instead of addressed, they look for ways to be heard. Sometimes, that means speaking off script. And that fear began to dominate conversations. Who is most likely to talk? Who feels the most frustrated? Who has the least to lose? Those questions circulated quietly. No names were spoken. None needed to be. Everyone knew. The strategy shifted again. Limit exposure. Reduce interviews. Control access even more tightly. If silence had worked for venues, maybe it could work here too. But silence doesn't erase curiosity. It sharpens it. And curiosity, once ignited, looks for confirmation. Which brings us to the moment that shattered the illusion of control. Because while leadership was focused on managing language, someone else was focused on something much simpler. The truth. And that truth didn't come out through a dramatic leak or a viral post. It came through something far more dangerous. Confirmation. A single acknowledgement. From a credible voice. Delivered casually, without realizing because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not yet. Not like this. Not from that direction.